Joseph at the door. I went numb. And he's on the other side knocking and knocking. And I'm shaking my head no because I don't want to hear it. These. Open the door. Open the door. He's alive.
Angel's husband, platoon leader John Arroyo, was rushed to Darnall Army Medical Center, where 2 surgeons immediately began operating to save his life. They soon discovered that a .45 caliber bullet had severed John's jugular vein and lodged deep within the nerves of his right shoulder. One of the physicians was ENT Dr. Alex McKinley.
Close proximity gunshot wound to the neck with an expanding hematoma is a grave prognosis. We knew that it was go time. We made an incision over the area to try to control the bleeding. Once we stopped that, we exhaled a bit, but there was still bright red bleeding, and so there was additional injuries. We looked and we knew that the bullet had gone through his what's called voice box, the area where your Adam's apple essentially is, your vocal cords, shattered his thyroid cartilage. And we knew that there was probably some significant damage to that area of his neck.
To help John breathe, doctors inserted a tracheostomy tube in his neck. Then, Angel was finally able to see him.
They took me back there. It was not my husband. His head was bigger than a basketball. His tongue was sticking out. I wouldn't even go back in. I just kept praying that everything would be okay.
The following day, John was placed in a medically induced coma and transferred to Scott and White Memorial Hospital for additional care. There, doctors told Angel their prognosis for John.
At that time, we knew, A, he had lost a lot of blood, B, that his voice was probably going to be different because of the amount of injury that was sustained in the voice box, and we didn't know if his voice would ever be normal again. And then C, his arm and the movement of his arm based on where that bullet went, we had no idea if that was going to come back either.
Army Specialist Ivan Lopez opened fire, killing 3 people and wounding 16 others.
Confronted by military police in a parking lot, he then turned the gun on himself.
So one of the gentlemen in that particular mass shooting at Fort Hood served in the Green Beret, attacked at home, a Green Beret's survival story of the Fort Hood shooting. Captain John Arroyo Jr. joins us now. He's captain retired. And John, it's good of you to join us this hour. First of all, I have to say, and we say this quite a bit when we talk to veterans who have served in the U.S. military and certainly in harm's way, to thank you so much for your service, because you get it. You understand that freedom matters and people living in our nation, they matter. But on that day that you were attacked, along with so many others there at Fort Hood, did you feel that your life mattered?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for allowing me to be here. And it is an honor. And you're worth my service, and so was the American people. And so, yes, they matter. We went to war for a nation, but when we fought for the men and women to the left and right of us. But to answer your question, yes, my life mattered. But what caused me to fight when my life poured out on the ground, I really wasn't thinking about me. I began to think about my family. I began to think about my wife and my children. And like so many veterans, we go to war, again, for a nation. But what keeps us going is knowing that we're going to make it back to our children, to our loved ones, to our spouses. And so as I was on the ground, my life did matter, but really what I was concerned about was my family.
Spoken like a man who truly loves his family, and obviously as a member of the Green Beret, you are taught and trained to love your not only love your country, but love your fellow brothers and sisters in arms and in harm's way. So that day you're in harm's way. Take me over the circumstances of what unfolded that day, and just take me through that again, if you can relive that without going through the trauma that it caused.
Yeah, no, actually, I thank you for asking because it's this message and this experience is to help others. Um, you know, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the base Fort Hood, as you mentioned, and I was getting out of my car. I parked at my unit headquarters, and I had to run into the supply office there in the headquarters office about 4 o'clock before everybody started leaving for the day. And so I parked my car and I exit my vehicle and I start stepping away, and instantly, only feet away from my vehicle, I hear shots fired. And I heard those shots to my 1 o'clock. So just so your listeners would understand, is I'm looking towards my 1 o'clock down a road that divided my organization, which is a medical organization, from a transportation unit. And so I'm looking down this road, and a vehicle comes from that road that I'm looking at, and it comes in front of me. But, you know, when we go to the mall, the supermarket, when we're on base and a vehicle pulls in a parking lot, that's not uncommon. No one thinks that they're in danger in those moments. And no one ever thinks that they're in danger on base. Like, who would ever think that on a military installation that they have to fight for their life? Not me, and especially someone that's been to combat 3 times, as a former Green Beret. I never thought that I would have to, that my life would be endangered by a fellow service member, but that's exactly what was happening. What I was hearing was this service member, his name is Ivan Lopez. He was driving down the road that I was looking down, and he was shooting at everybody that was standing outside their workplace in the back of their work building. And that's actually what I was hearing. So when he pulls up in front of me, I see him and I acknowledge him, but I turn my attention away from him because I assumed that the vehicle that I looked at was just going to keep going. And I turned my head back to the 1 o'clock after I acknowledged him in the vehicle, and the next shot I heard ripped through my throat. That day I took a .45 caliber that severed my jugular vein, went through my voice box, and traveled into my right shoulder. He drove off. He didn't stick around to figure out what was going to happen to me next. He probably just assumed that was a kill shot. For your listeners that do hunting and they're avid, weapon experts, a 45 to the throat is for most people is an instant death sentence.
Absolutely.
And I remember thinking to myself, am I shot? Because I didn't feel any pain. There was nothing that immediately told me that I was shot, except for all in that moment, the air in my lungs just escaped, and then just the mass amounts of blood. And I'm not trying to be too gory, but that's just the reality. All of a sudden, blood just started pouring from my neck, and so I just turned away from him, and I don't fall on the ground, which most people would assume would have happened. But I head back towards my car, just trying to get away from him, and it was there that I finally collapsed, only just trying to get back to my vehicle, trying to get away, and I fall on the floor, and my life is pouring out. And this is what I share, because see, my dad died when I was 5 years old, and I didn't realize how much not having a dad in my life affected me. So I ran around looking for a dad my entire life. I went out looking for a dad until I realized I had a father. I got into gangs at a young age because I was looking for approval, not because I needed community, but because I needed people to tell me how cool I was, because I never was affirmed by my dad. And then when I became a Green Beret, initially I didn't want to be a Green Beret. I just wanted to tell people I wanted to be a Green Beret so they would give me all their fanfare, right? And so, and all that was the root of never being affirmed by my dad, never hearing I love you and I'm proud of you. So I needed people to tell me that they were proud of me. So the world would tell you, if you have this, then you have life. If you have this much money, then you've made it. If you have these letters behind your name, John, you've made it. And so what I'm saying to you is that when I was on the ground and my life was pouring out, the stuff that the world told me if I had it, that stuff never came to mind. I didn't think 1 second about the likes on social media. I didn't think about how much money I had in my account. I didn't think about all the titles and the badges and all the things that the military, if you have this, then you are someone that people look up to. What I thought about in those moments were the people that I sacrificed most. And the only thing that came to mind when I thought I only had seconds to live, were the people that I sacrificed most, and it was my children and it was my wife. And in that moment, I hear this audible voice, John, get up, or your wife will die. I couldn't. I didn't know what was going on in that moment.
Wait, John, get up, or your wife will die.
That's exactly what I heard, and I actually heard it twice. And the second time I heard it in a more stern tone. But here's why. You know, if we walk into the homes of the American people today, we would get a backdoor view, right, of what's going on in their life. This is what was happening in my life. 6 months before I was shot, when we left from North Carolina, and we were new to Fort Hood, Texas. We had only been there 5 months. My mother-in-law and my father-in-law both died 9 days apart, 6 months before I was shot. 2 years before that, my brother-in-law died in a hunting accident. And so my wife had lost her mother, her father, and her brother in such a short period of time. And when I was an angry, mean, drunk Green Beret back in the day, coming back and forth from deployments, I used to beat my family down with my tongue. I didn't put my hands on them, but I could take my frustrations. I can bring war back into my home, and that's exactly what I did. And my wife, during that time, was a 2-time suicide survivor. So what am I saying to you? Is that God stepped into that moment and said, John, if you don't get up, your wife is going to take her life. And this time, she will not make a mistake.
Incredible. And so as you're going through this and you hear this voice, and I'll say it for you, you hear this voice as the voice of God intervening in your life. You're hanging in the balance of life and death. And 2 times you hear, John, get up or your wife will die. What did you do after that second voice that you heard?
Yeah, and let me say this because I think this is important for your listeners. Jesus didn't shoot me to give me a testimony. We live in a fallen world. But what he did do, and this is what your listeners need to hear, is he stepped into the middle of it. He stepped into when my life was pouring out and he said, get up. And I had an option because it was actually easier to die that day. It was easier to stay on the ground. But I made a decision for my family. So to answer your question, I got up and I started moving, and I wasn't sure if I had 5 steps left in me or not. But by faith, I got up and just started walking, and I went looking for help. You know, I'm on a base that has about 30,000 soldiers. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it should have been like a beehive. It should have been people all around.
Yeah.
But only one soldier from a distance I see, and I'm trying to get to this soldier. So him and I are on this walking path. He's walking towards me, and I'm walking towards him. And I stopped 10 feet in front of him, and he stopped 10 feet in front of me. And he's real like hyper vigilant, and he's looking around. And I realized that I'm standing in front of the man that just shot me. So he shot me from his vehicle, drove off, got out of his vehicle looking for more people to shoot. And him and I ended up on the same walking path. I'm looking at him and I stop and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm standing in front of the shooter. And in that moment, Jesus blinds him. He turns, he looks at me, looks to the left and right, like I wasn't even there, turns, walks in the building that him and I are both standing in front of, shoots 3 more people, walks away, and shoots himself. That day, he shot 19 of us, and then he took his life, and he became victim number 20.
It's just
numerous soldiers were standing, and they watched me. Not everybody came to my aid. There were only about 5 soldiers that ran out and put their life in danger. And I don't blame anybody. I'm not saying that. But I'm using this as an antidote for what? To let you know that not everybody is coming. That you may be the answer to somebody else. And so when my life was pouring out, there were several that ran to me. They got me in the back of a truck, and they got me into the hospital there at Darnall Hospital on Fort Hood. And and what was happening is they had to put pressure on my throat, right? Because whenever someone's injured, what do? Especially when there's bleeding, we put pressure. Well, where were they putting pressure? They were putting it on my throat. So they were stopping me from bleeding. So I kept smacking their hand out of the way. But I got to the hospital. The docs were phenomenal. They intubated me because they knew that they had to keep my airway open. They're rushing me towards the OR now because they know that I have to get into surgery right away. So they get me to the elevator, and now in this moment, all of the doctors that are at this hospital, it's a mass casualty situation. So every doctor in that hospital is all hands on deck, and they're all rushing towards the ER because we're starting to come in. So when the nurses get me to the elevator to get me into the OR for surgery right away, the elevator doors open and two doctors come running out of the elevator they're trying to put me in, and they were the ear, nose, and throat surgeons. Wow. Everything I needed was exactly where it needed to be the moment I obeyed that voice. And so, I told you the story about, dang, that dude is bleeding because of this. I'm now using my scars to go to those people where no one else is coming. I'm using my brokenness. My wife and I are using our story, using our life to go and to let people know we're coming because we've lived it. There's so many veterans that won't listen or won't talk to a physician because he doesn't have the experience that they do. But my wife and I have been broken in every conceivable way, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And so we can use our scars and say, we know what you've been through. And not only from war or being wounded by someone you trusted, but we were also wounded as young kids and knowing that childhood trauma of not having a daddy in your life or the things that she went through with her mom. So we're using every bit of our lives to bring hope and healing to so many.
John, the story is so moving and so real, and in the midst of it, so victorious. We're talking to Captain John Arroyo Jr., a former member of the U.S. military, Green Beret, served his country proudly, attacked at home, speaking about the 2014 shooting that took place at Fort Hood on April 2nd, 2014. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to John. Military bases in the United States, and so much training is done there, so much activity goes on there.
Station.
And you just went through the dramatic details of what happened to you being shot in the throat and being told to get up by a voice that you recognize to your account as being the voice of God, and stating that Jesus stepped in to actually help you and save you, and then how everything started coming together. But you were told by that voice, as you explained to me earlier, that you were told to get up or your wife will die because she would have possibly gone on to take her own life and be successful at it this particular time. But you also spoke about fatherlessness. And as you know, John, fatherlessness in America is broken. It's severed. And men need to find a way to be men and be the daddies of their children. Even if they're divorced or separated, as I say, they still need to find a way to be involved in the lives of their children. Tell me why that is so important to you, because as you were growing up, you experienced fatherlessness in your own home.
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I just recently wrote a new book, and it's called I Never Heard My Dad Say. And here's what I've learned from that. There's a scripture where David in Psalm 139 is praying, and he says, God, search my heart and reveal to me if there's any wicked thing inside of it. And so I did the same thing. When I retired from the military, I ended up on a ministry. I was working for Dave Reber Ministries, and ministers don't often think that they have anything going on in their lives or there's things in their hearts from years ago. And so when I prayed that prayer, God revealed to me that I almost like I had an orphan heart, and it goes back to my dad not being in my home. My dad died when I was about 5 years old of cirrhosis of the liver. He's 34 years old. He ends up dying of cirrhosis of the liver. So I grew up without a biological father. I mean, I had a good family. I had men in my life, but there was a void in my life, in my heart, that would never be filled because my dad wasn't there. So what I realized and what God was showing me is that I went looking for a dad my entire life. I went looking for that affirmation. You know, I once had a pastor tell me, he said, John, when you hunt and fish with your kids when they're young, you won't have to hunt for them when they're older. I was like, I wish I would have heard that when I was younger. Man, I mean, but here's what God revealed to me, is that I went out looking for a dad when I always had a father. And when I realized finally that God, it healed that I had been searching for, because every little boy and every little girl needs their identity help that usually comes in their home from their daddy and their mommy as a family is the home front. But there was a void. I had a good mom and a good dad. I had a good mom and good people in my life, but my dad wasn't there. And so I didn't realize till recently how much not having my dad affected me all through my life. And it caused me to go and seek unhealthy ways of affirmation. I got into gangs. I got jumped into a gang at 7th grade. I ended up a teenage father at 9th grade. I ended up doing methamphetamines for the first time in 12th grade. The reason why I joined the military, I'm patriotic today, and I'm so happy that I retired as an Army captain, a Green Beret. But that's not why I walked into the military. I walked into the military because I was addicted to drugs, and my family told me, if you don't get out of here, you'll be a loser the rest of your life. And so I attribute that to not having my dad in my life. If I would have had my dad there and he would have took me fishing, if we would have did those things, man, he would have. My mom and my grandmother wouldn't have had to hunt for me later.
On the campus of a U.S. military base, and we were all thinking, what is going wrong in America? And here we are today, and we're now forced to ask ourselves, what's right about America? And what's right is the story we just heard and witnessed through the life and the struggles and the trials and the triumph of Captain John Arroyo Jr. Get up and live the best life you can live. God bless America. God bless the veterans who served in the United States military. We remember you and we thank you.
In my America, my children are black and white, one shade of beautiful, so precious in God's sight. In my America, all lives matter. So let's stop the chatter that tears us apart. We are a family, together you and me, agreeing to disagree, but still live in harmony. The dream that gives hope to us is as strong as it ever was. United we stand, divided we fall. That's my America. In my America, there is no left or right. We're all on common ground. Darkness gives way to light. In my America, you give more than you take. And when someone has lost their way, you lend them a hand and say, we are a family, together you and me, agreeing to disagree, but still live in harmony. The dream that gives hope to us